When the gala's MC scoffed, "You're an actor, not a musician," laughter erupted across the auditorium. But Keanu didn't argue. He simply walked to the stage, picked up his mother's forgotten flute, and began to play. What followed wasn't just music. It was a moment so powerful, it changed every soul in the room forever. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The stack of mail on Keanu's kitchen table had been there for a week. Script offers, charity invitations, fan letters, all mixed together in a quiet pile of obligation. He never rushed through them anymore. The spotlight had never been the place he sought comfort, and now more than ever, he chose his moments carefully. Still, something in the silver envelope caught his eye. It wasn't flashy. No gold leaf, no bold branding, just a soft, handwritten return address. Willow Glen Academy, Los Angeles. He tore it open carefully. Inside was a folded ivory cardstock invitation with ornate lettering. At the bottom, in blue ink, someone had written a short personal note. "Keanu, this year we're honoring your mother's flute, donated a decade ago to inspire future musicians. We'd be so grateful if you could attend. Principal Dorsey." Keanu leaned back in his chair. The name of the school felt vaguely familiar, but it took him a moment to place it. Then it clicked. Years ago, when he'd quietly helped set up a few scholarships for underfunded music programs, Patricia Taylor, his mother, had donated a silver flute to one of the pilot campuses. It had been her teaching instrument, used during private lessons when money was tight. She had called it her little silver voice. He hadn't thought about that flute in years. His fingers grazed the edge of the card. A school gala, black tie, silent auction, spotlights, cameras. The kind of thing he usually avoided unless it was deeply personal. And yet, here it was, personal. He stood and walked to the bookshelf, scanning the titles until he found a worn photo album tucked between two film journals. Opening it, he flipped through pages of old Polaroids and snapshots. There was one photo in particular that always stopped him. His mother, sitting on the worn couch of their tiny Toronto apartment, hair pinned up, her hands lifting the flute to her lips. He remembered how, even with the sounds of the city outside, she could make that instrument feel like silence had a melody. She used to say, music wasn't about performance, it was about presence, about holding space in the air that someone else needed to breathe in. The gala was only 3 nights away. He sighed, then he picked up his phone. "Hi, Mom." Her voice on the other end was warm, familiar, and laced with the same old energy she always carried, even at her age. "Darling, everything okay? I got a letter," Keanu said, "from Willow Glen, about the flute you donated. They're doing some kind of event." There was a short pause. Then, laughter. "I wondered if they'd ever find a use for that old thing. Are they still polishing it up, pretending it's priceless?" "It meant something," he replied. "You gave it away because you believed it would." Patricia's tone softened. "I gave it because I couldn't teach forever, but maybe that flute still could. Are you thinking about going?" "I'm not sure," he said honestly. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something he wasn't expecting. "Keanu, sometimes people need to remember that even the quietest things can sing." He let the words settle in. "I think you should go," she said finally. "Not because it's about me, but because that flute was never about me either. It was about what comes next." He smiled faintly. "I'll think about it." "I know. You will," she said with a chuckle. "And you'll go." The next day, Keanu's assistant texted him twice to confirm. Black tie gala, 6 p.m., Willow Glen Academy. Parking and back. He hadn't given an official RSVP, but word got around quickly. When Keanu Reeves agreed to show up somewhere, even silently, people made room. On the afternoon of the event, he stood in front of the mirror for longer than usual. The black suit was pressed, nothing extravagant. No cufflinks, no red carpet shine. Just something clean and timeless. His hair was slightly tousled, and he let it stay that way. He glanced at the clock. Early evening light was fading outside his window. Sunset would cast golden beams across the hills by the time he arrived. He slipped on a pair of worn dress shoes and took one last look at himself, not as a star, not as Neo or John Wick, but just a man honoring something his mother once believed in. As he walked out to his motorcycle, he paused. Something tugged at him, a memory not quite full. That sound, the breath before the first note. The way the flute seemed to catch light when his mother lifted it in the air. It had shimmered in the living room like a ribbon of silver air. He adjusted his gloves and started the engine. The ride across Los Angeles was quiet. The city hadn't quite settled yet, but the traffic had thinned. As he neared the school, the winding road passed through quiet residential streets. It wasn't a Hollywood setting, it was something more grounded. Willow Glen Academy sat atop a small hill. The campus was old but elegant, with red brick buildings and archways wrapped in ivy. As he pulled into the side parking lot, a few parents dressed in suits and gowns were stepping out of Blacktown cars. Keanu parked his bike quietly in the far corner. He preferred to arrive unnoticed. No cameras greeted him, no red carpet, just a narrow side entrance marked staff and a quiet hallway inside. He walked through it, the echo of his steps bouncing off the tile floors. Eventually, the corridor opened into a large, warmly lit atrium. String lights dangled from the ceiling. Small tables lined the room, each hosting an item for silent auction: vintage guitars, signed scores, framed art. And in the center, on a raised pedestal behind velvet rope, sat the silver flute. Even in the soft light, it glowed. A small engraved plaque sat beside it, donated by Patricia Taylor, mentor, mother, and musician, in honor of teaching children the power of quiet beauty. Keanu stepped closer. The glass casing was clean, the flute perfectly positioned on navy blue velvet. It was surreal. He remembered the weight of it, not just in grams, but in meaning. His fingers flexed gently at his side. It had been decades since he touched that instrument. His mother had tried to teach him once, but he'd always been better at listening than playing. Still, the sound of it was woven into his memory like a thread. He heard someone whisper behind him, "Is that really his mom's flute?" Another voice answered, "Yeah. She used to teach in Toronto. He donated it on her behalf." He turned slightly and gave them a small, polite smile. They stepped back, surprised he heard. Across the room, the string quartet was tuning their instruments. A few school staff bustled about with clipboards and nervous energy. The head of the school, Principal Dorsey, spotted him and made her way over. "Mr. Reeves," she said gently, her voice warm with gratitude. "Thank you so much for coming. We weren't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either," he replied. She nodded. "I hope it's not too strange seeing it again. Your mother's donation meant a lot to this program. It's inspired more students than I can count." Keanu looked back at the flute. "She always said it wasn't hers, just something passing through her hands." Dorsey smiled. "That sounds like her." Then she touched his arm lightly. "We're honored to have you here tonight. If you need a quiet place before we begin, we've got a lounge just behind the stage. No press, no attention." "Thank you," Keanu said softly. "But I'm all right. I'd like to stay here for a bit." Keanu drifted away from the display, taking in the rest of the space. Around him, parents mingled with donors, sipping champagne and nibbling hors d'oeuvres served by quietly efficient student volunteers. Conversations fluttered around him. College acceptances, rising tuition, who funded which music wing. But he wasn't really listening. His eyes were fixed on the student orchestra setting up on the elevated stage. A girl no older than 16 adjusted her violin chin rest nervously. Next to her, a boy clutched drumsticks like they might shatter in his grip. They weren't professionals. They weren't trying to be. But there was an earnestness in the way they tuned their instruments that reminded Keanu of the purity his mother once spoke about. He remembered her saying once, "Some people play to be heard. Others play to hear themselves again." He turned slightly and noticed a large black banner being unfurled above the stage. In gold lettering it read, "Willow Glen Academy Annual Arts Gala, celebrating the power of music education." Beside the stage, a sharply dressed man was holding court with a group of alumni and trustees. He wore a navy suit that hugged his frame, a designer tie with a gold pin, and shoes that had never touched a sidewalk. That was Julian Mercer, the evening's MC, former sitcom star turned semi-retired presenter. Keanu remembered him vaguely from the early 2000s, charming, witty, always chasing the next gig. Julian glanced across the room and caught sight of Keanu. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes, but he nodded, clearly trying to assess the weight of having a real star in the audience. A moment later, he leaned in to the event coordinator and whispered something, prompting a small chuckle. Keanu noticed. He didn't flinch. He just folded his hands in front of him and continued watching the students prepare. Soon, a quiet chime echoed through the room. A staff member gently urged guests to begin taking their seats in the auditorium. The main performance was about to begin. Keanu walked slowly down the center aisle, not seeking attention, but still drawing curious glances. Some people whispered his name. A few smiled. Others just stared. He nodded politely and took a seat in the second row, off to the side, far from the front and center. The theater lights dimmed slightly. On stage, the student orchestra was still tuning, fingers trembling. A few parents fidgeted with their phones until the lights fully lowered, and the sound system clicked on with a slight hiss. Julian Mercer stepped into the spotlight, microphone in hand, smile polished. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Willow Glen Academy Annual Arts Gala," he began smoothly. "Tonight we celebrate not just talent, but the promise of what's yet to come." There was polite applause. "We're honored by your presence, and especially by some very special guests this evening." He paused. Among them, none other than Keanu Reeves, whose legendary kindness matches his fame. Scattered claps. A few heads turned. Keanu nodded again, quietly. Julian smirked faintly. "Now, I don't know if he brought any samurai swords with him," he said with a wink, "but we're thrilled to have him here to help us raise awareness for the next generation of artists, even if he's more used to action scenes than arpeggios." Some chuckles rolled through the audience. Keanu remained still. The students behind Julian looked confused, unsure if they were supposed to laugh or not. One violinist glanced down at her sheet music, her brow furrowed. Julian continued, seemingly unaware or uncaring of the subtle discomfort he was creating. Keanu's gaze shifted again to the flute. Display at the side of the stage, still visible under soft lighting. His mother's instrument, shining quietly, untouched. It wasn't made for spectacle. It had always been about connection. As the crowd settled in and Julian began introducing the orchestra's opening performance, Keanu sat in the hush of the moment. His hands relaxed, his mind steady. Whatever was coming next, he didn't need to speak. The music and the memory would carry more weight than words ever could. Julian Mercer's smile lit up the stage, like a spotlight that had been waiting too long to be turned back on. He moved with the confidence of a man who had once been on the cover of every entertainment magazine. A sitcom king of the late 90s, a household name turned host for hire. He still wore fame like a tailored suit, but time had softened its edges. The applause he once commanded now had to be coaxed. He didn't mind, not outwardly, not yet. He adjusted the mic stand and grinned at the audience, which was filled with affluent parents, alumni, and well-dressed benefactors trying to look engaged while scanning the room for familiar faces. His voice was smooth, practiced, and just loud enough to pull attention back when it drifted. Before we begin our showcase this evening, I want to thank all of you, our donors, families, and friends, for believing in the arts and in these incredible young musicians behind me. There was polite applause. Julian let the moment linger, then leaned forward with a wink. "And I have to say, it's not every day we get a real movie star in our humble auditorium." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Some clapped lightly. Julian turned slightly toward the second row. "Yes, ladies and gentlemen, that's right. Mr. Keanu Reeves has graced us with his presence tonight. More applause now. Slightly louder." Keanu gave a quiet nod, the corner of his mouth turning in a gentle smile. Julian kept going. "Now, I don't want to make a big deal of it, I know Keanu prefers to stay out of the spotlight. He paused for effect. But I will say, when I saw him walk in, I thought, what's next? Neo joins the jazz band? John Wick on tambourine? Some of the audience chuckled. A few glanced toward Keanu, unsure if they should laugh or not. Julian pressed forward anyway. Let's just hope he doesn't break the stage with those Matrix moves. This time the laugh was louder. Keanu didn't blink. He kept his expression neutral, neither smiling nor scowling, as if the comment passed through him without touching anything. Julian moved on quickly, shifting the tone before the moment could become awkward. In all seriousness, it's always good to see people of influence supporting young talent. We need more of that, especially in this day and age. He clapped once and gestured grandly behind him. Tonight's program is about the students, about their courage, their creativity, and their passion. These kids have been practicing day and night for this very moment. He turned back to the crowd. But just remember, when the movie roles fade and the lights go down, it's the musicians who keep the world in rhythm. Can I get an amen for that? A few people called out affirmatively. Others just clapped. Keanu sat still, his hands folded in his lap. His eyes didn't flicker. Not when Julian name-dropped him. Not when the jokes got a little sharp. Not even when the spotlight intentionally hovered a little longer on his face than on the others in the crowd. If Julian was trying to provoke a reaction, he wasn't getting one. Julian moved about the stage with exaggerated charm, the kind meant to entertain at charity golf tournaments or daytime talk shows. It was showbiz smooth, well-rehearsed, confident, and just a little too much. But underneath that slick delivery was something else. A hint of discomfort. A thread of insecurity wound tightly around every joke that tried too hard. Because deep down, Julian Mercer knew what everyone else in that room knew too. Keanu Reeves didn't need a microphone to command attention. He didn't need clever wordplay or punchlines. His presence, even in silence, carried more weight than Julian's entire resume of sitcoms, hosting gigs, and forgettable movies. And that truth, however unspoken, hung in the air like a shadow just behind the stage lights. As Julian introduced the first act, a trio of 7th grade vocalists performing a jazz medley, he kept glancing down at the front row. More specifically, at Keanu. And every time he did, there was a slight shift in his voice, a flicker of something that wasn't quite jealousy. It was more fragile than that. It was resentment dressed up as confidence. The student performance began. The girls sang beautifully, their harmonies soft but clear, their nervousness visible yet endearing. The crowd gave a warm round of applause, but Julian couldn't help himself. As the girls exited the stage, he stepped back into the spotlight and said, "Incredible, right? I mean, who knew middle school voices could carry more emotion than half of Hollywood these days?" Another laugh, more subtle this time. Julian looked toward Keanu as if the punchline was meant for him. Still, Keanu didn't flinch. He clapped with everyone else. Nothing about his posture changed. His stillness, his calm, it wasn't indifference, it was restraint, the kind that comes from years of practice. Principal Dorsey, standing just off stage left, noticed it too. She narrowed her eyes slightly as Julian walked past her, then whispered something to the stage manager. She'd worked with enough performers in her life to recognize when someone on stage wasn't just hosting, but compensating. Julian took the mic again. "Next up, we've got our chamber strings ensemble performing a Canadian folk melody arranged specially for tonight's event." He paused theatrically. "Some of you may not know this, but our auction centerpiece, the vintage flute donated by Patricia Taylor, has deep roots in that style of music." He looked down at Keanu again. "In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if Mr. Reeves himself could give us a little demo later. Unless, of course, he left his superpowers at home." Laughter again, louder this time. Julian smiled wide, but his eyes weren't smiling. This time, a few people in the audience looked toward Keanu with more hesitation. Some weren't sure if this was all in good fun anymore. A parent in the third row leaned to her husband and whispered, "That felt like a dig, didn't it?" He nodded slightly. But Keanu? He remained exactly as he was, hands resting in his lap, face calm, eyes watching the students, not the MC. Julian wrapped up the string ensemble's applause with an exaggerated bow, then strolled back to center stage, as if the night belonged to him. The lights chased him like obedient pets, warm beams following every step, but they only made the tension sharper. Something about his performance no longer felt like hosting it, felt like a contest. He pulled the mic close. "And now," he said, drawing out the words, "before our intermission, a quick thank you to our distinguished guests. So many artists, philanthropists, and dreamers in this room tonight." He swept his arm toward the front row and then landed on Keanu again. And of course, Hollywood royalty, gracing us with his mysterious aura. "You know, Keanu, I half expected you to walk in wearing sunglasses and a trench coat." A wave of chuckles rolled through the crowd. A few people clapped, unsure whether it was a compliment or not. Julian grinned as though it had been a knockout line. Keanu simply offered a small nod. "Seriously though," Julian continued, pacing now, "we're honored. It's not every day our little school gets a cameo from a blockbuster icon. I hope you're enjoying your brief visit to reality before you slip back into cyberspace." There was laughter again, less enthusiastic this time, thinner around the edges. Some of the earlier warmth in the room had cooled. People were noticing. The jokes weren't light anymore. They were aimed, measured, a little too sharp to be playful. Keanu didn't defend himself. He didn't need to. He sat like a still point in the middle of a spinning room, his face unreadable. But something subtle had changed. A slight tightening of his jaw, a stillness in his hands. It wasn't anger, it was the effort of staying calm. Julian felt it, even if he didn't understand it. And it made him press harder. "Well," Julian said, breaking into a laugh that was a shade too loud, "here's hoping Neo doesn't break the stage on his way out." A few isolated laughs. Mostly silence. A moment of awkward stillness flickered across the auditorium, and then Julian clapped his hands briskly and announced intermission. People rose from their seats. Conversations buzzed, but Keanu stayed sitting, still and quiet, as the crowd flowed around him like water around a stone. Keanu drifted through the rows of display pedestals with a quietness that felt almost out of place in the Gala's electric hum. Glass cases glimmered under soft overhead lights, each cradling instruments like artifacts from another world. A violin with a cracked bridge, once owned by a concert master in Vienna. A scuffed trumpet that had traveled through countless jazz bars in New Orleans. A cello signed by an entire youth orchestra. But Keanu's feet slowed, as if pulled by a string, when his eyes caught a subtle silver glint near the center of the hall. There it was, the flute. Slim, delicate, its surface faintly burnished by decades of touch. It lay on a bed of navy velvet inside a square glass case. The engraved brass plaque beneath it read, "Donated by Patricia Taylor, used in Toronto symphonic training." Keanu's breath caught softly in his chest. He moved closer until the glass almost reflected his face back at him. His fingertips hovered above the glass but didn't touch. The sight of it unraveled something inside him. A thread of memory he hadn't meant to tug. He could almost hear it again. Not the echo of any specific melody, but the faint shimmer of tone that used to float through the walls of their old apartment on nights when she practiced. He remembered lying on the carpet as a boy, sketchbook open, drawing superheroes with tangled hair and crooked smiles, while the notes from that flute curled around him like invisible ribbons. Patricia had been everything at once back then, single mother, costume designer, teacher to neighborhood kids who came over after school. He could see her crouched at the kitchen table, pinning fabric with her hair falling into her face, humming softly to herself. She would pause only to pick up the flute and play a few quick scales, as if reminding her hands who they were, who she was. It wasn't formal practice, just breathing in music like air, letting it spill out. He hadn't understood it then, not fully. Now, he did. It had been her anchor. The world around him blurred slightly as he stood there. Gala guests drifted by, their conversations thinning to a murmur. The laughter and glasses clinking at the open bar seemed to fade. All he could see was that silver flute lying in the case, like a piece of his childhood somehow frozen in time. He wondered if anyone here knew how many nights it had sung her back to life when exhaustion threatened to swallow her whole. A small voice broke through the haze. "Is it really your mom's?" Keanu turned his head. A girl stood a few steps away, maybe 9 or 10, wearing a pale blue dress with a ribbon sliding crookedly from her hair. She looked up at him with wide eyes, clutching a folded Gala program in both hands. "Yes," he said gently, and a soft smile tugged at the edge of his mouth. It was hers. Her mouth opened slightly, as if she wanted to ask more, but wasn't sure if she should. She glanced from the flute to him and back again. Did she play it here?" "She played it in Toronto," Keanu said. "A long time ago, before I was even your age." Keanu stared at the now empty space where the folder had been, his thoughts racing like cars on a freeway at midnight. He felt the old familiar tension tightening his jaw, the same way it had years ago on film sets when everything went wrong and he had to stay calm. Only this wasn't a movie set. This was real. Someone had deliberately taken the only tangible link he had to Marcus. He crouched down, scanning the floor, as if the folder might have simply slipped out of sight. Dust clung to his fingertips as he brushed along the cracked wooden boards. Nothing, not even a scrap of paper. The air seemed colder now, sharper, like the room itself was holding its breath. Questions began pressing in on him from all sides. Who had known about the folder? Hardly anyone knew he had come here at all. The thought that someone else was following the same trail, watching from the shadows, made his skin crawl. Keanu forced himself to slow his breathing. He rose, scanning the corners again, and noticed faint scuff marks on the floor near the back door, fresh marks in the layer of settled dust. Someone had been here, and recently. His mind replayed the moment he had arrived, how the back door had been slightly ajar. He had assumed it was from years of disrepair. Now he wasn't so sure. A low hum from outside caught his attention, the fading sound of a car engine. He darted to the window, but all he caught was the blur of taillights vanishing down the winding road. His pulse hammered as a rush of adrenaline hit. Whoever took the folder wasn't just ahead of him. They knew what he was looking for. Keanu's eyes fell on a rusty metal cabinet against the wall. It was dented and leaning, but one drawer stood slightly open. He crossed the room and pulled it the rest of the way. Inside lay an assortment of forgotten relics, faded invoices, old photographs, and a cracked coffee mug with the garage's faded logo. Beneath it all, tucked at the back, he found something unexpected, a Polaroid photo. It showed a much younger Marcus, grinning awkwardly at the camera, standing beside an old motorcycle. Keanu's heart lurched. He turned the photo over. There was a date written in blue ink, nearly smudged away. The 12th of June, 1997, and beneath that, in a rushed scrawl, last day before he disappeared. Keanu clenched the photo in his hand, a mix of grief and determination flooding through him. The folder might be gone, but this photo was proof. Marcus had been real. He had worked here. Someone had tried to erase that truth, but they hadn't succeeded completely. He slipped the photo carefully into his jacket pocket and took one last look around the garage. Then he stepped back into the cool night air, the scent of oil and rust trailing behind him. The road ahead was darker now, both literally and figuratively, but his resolve had hardened. Whoever had taken the folder had just made one critical mistake. They made it personal. Keanu stood silently in the dim light of the garage, the scent of engine oil and dust thick in the air, and stared at the lined, careworn face of Daniel. The man who had once been larger than life now looked impossibly fragile, like a painting left too long in the sunday. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There were no rehearsed lines, no red carpet smiles, only the low hum of a fluorescent bulb and the sound of Daniel's labored breathing. Daniel broke the silence with a faint chuckle, though it carried a sharp edge. "You're staring, Reeves. You always did." like you were trying to see the soul under the skin. Keanu managed a thin smile. Maybe I am. Careful, Daniel said, easing himself into a chair. Not much left to see. The words hung between them, heavier than the rusted tools on the wall. Keanu felt something crack open inside him, something he had kept locked away through years of fame, fortune, and loss. This was the man who had once shielded him from Hollywood's wolves, who had fought to give him his first role, who had believed in him when Keanu barely believed in himself. And now Daniel sat there, skin sallow and thin, hands trembling as if even gravity had turned against him. I'm sorry I didn't come sooner, Keanu said, voice low. Daniel waved a bony hand. Don't waste breath on that. The world spins fast. I just fell off the ride. Keanu stepped closer, kneeling so they were eye to eye. You didn't fall off. You were pushed, and no one caught you. Daniel's eyes glistened for just an instant before he blinked it away. I don't need catching. I just needed to see if I mattered. Even once. Keanu's throat tightened. He reached out and gently clasped Daniel's trembling hands. You mattered, more than you'll ever know. You shaped me. You changed my life. And I never told you that. For the first time, Daniel's lips curved into something real. A fragile smile. Then maybe that's enough. The weight in Keanu's chest shifted. It didn't vanish, but it settled, like a stone placed gently rather than hurled. He realized he wasn't here to rescue Daniel or erase his suffering with some grand gesture. He was here simply to be present, to remind Daniel that he was not invisible, not forgotten, not unloved. As the afternoon light slanted through the garage window, catching on the motes of dust floating between them, Keanu felt time still. It was as if all the years and miles had dissolved, leaving only two souls who had once shared a dream and now shared something far more human, a quiet, aching truth. And in that silence, something unspoken passed between them. Not forgiveness, not pity. Something stronger. Recognition. Backstage at the Willow Glen Academy Auditorium, the air buzzed with the nervous flutter of tuning strings and whispered scales. The student orchestra was supposed to be rehearsing their final run-through before the gala performance, but the usual steady rhythm had fractured into chaos. Music stands clattered. A cello case lay half open, forgotten. The young musicians huddled in loose clusters, their voices tight with panic. Near the center of the cramped rehearsal room, Talia crouched on a folding chair, her violin resting across her knees. She was only 17, slight and pale, with sharp, dark eyes that seemed always to be calculating something. Normally, she was the quiet center of this whirlwind, the one who anchored them when they drifted. But tonight, her composure was cracking. It's confirmed, said Marcus, the percussionist, his voice cracking like the snare he'd been pounding a moment earlier. Elena's not coming, her mom just texted. She's got strep, high fever. She can't even talk. A hollow silence followed. Everyone knew what that meant. Elena wasn't just any player. She was their lead, flutist, the heart of their feature piece. Without her, the song would collapse. We can still play, said Noah, the cellist, though he sounded like he was trying to convince himself. We could just skip the flute parts. Skip them. Talia's voice was quiet but sharp. The entire first movement is the flute part. The violin answers it. The strings follow its phrasing. If there's no flute, it's not even the same piece anymore. Noah's shoulders sagged. He knew she was right. They all did. This was supposed to be their moment, playing a beloved Canadian folk melody arranged for student orchestra. They'd spent months shaping every phrase, preparing to show that their school's music program deserved the funding the gala might bring. Now, it felt like all that work was about to vanish. From the hallway just beyond the thin partition wall, the muffled swell of gala chatter seeped in. Laughter, glasses clinking, the rich hum of donors arriving in silk and suits. They were out there, expecting something polished, magical. Instead, what they might get was a disaster. Maybe we should just ask the coordinator to cut our set, muttered Marcus. Better than bombing in front of everyone. No, Talia said, more firmly this time. We don't cancel, not when the whole program depends on this. Her determination was steady, but her hands trembled when she picked up her bow again. She forced them still. Inside her chest, a drumbeat of dread pounded. She had to hold them together, somehow, even if she wasn't sure how. And then, as if summoned by the tension in the air, a smooth, amplified voice drifted from the main stage. Julian Mercer, the Gala's MC, was warming up the crowd. His words filtered faintly through the cracked door, laced with charm and a trace of something sharper, something performative. Julian's voice carried like a rehearsed melody dipped in sarcasm, its tone unmistakable even through the thin backstage door. Ladies and gentlemen, he drawled, I hope you're enjoying the fine wine and finer company. In a few moments, you'll witness the bright future of music. Our very own Willow Glen Student Orchestra. They've prepared something truly ambitious. There was polite applause, though faint. The students froze mid-motion, listening as though their fate was being unspooled by his tongue. Of course, Julian continued, we've had a tiny hiccup. Their soloist has fallen ill. A tragic loss, though perhaps not as tragic as my own attempt at piano lessons when I was 12. A ripple of laughter from the audience followed, easy and detached. Talia closed her eyes, pressing her thumb hard into the wood of her violin's neck. His flippancy felt like a punch. Julian let the laughter settle, then added with a mock-bright tone, but fear not, the show will go on. Maybe, just maybe, our special guest, the man of the hour, the man who dodges bullets in slow motion, might swoop in to save the day. What do you say, folks? Should we let Keanu fake the solo? A louder wave of laughter crashed through the auditorium. The students looked at each other, horrified. Marcus muttered, "Did he just say that out loud?" Noah grimaced and buried his face in his cello case. Talia's stomach tightened like a pulled string. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone. That polished sneer, the way he turned their emergency into a punchline and Keanu into a prop. She glanced instinctively toward the wings, though Keanu wasn't visible from here. Somewhere out there, he had to have heard it too. A thin hush followed Julian's joke before the audience began to chatter again, their voices layered with amusement and faint disapproval. A few parents sitting near the back exchanged glances, their smiles fading. The line had been meant to be funny, but something about it had soured. Julian didn't seem to notice. He launched into a glowing introduction of the evening's next donor presentation, his voice rising with theatrical flourish, as if nothing had happened. Back in the cramped rehearsal space, the students sat frozen in the silence left behind. "That was humiliating," whispered Maya, the second violinist, her voice barely audible. Talia nodded once, her face still as stone. "We're going to play anyway." "But how?" Marcus asked. "We literally don't have a flute." Talia opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. The truth was, she didn't know. The truth was, for the first time in months, she felt like they were about to break apart completely. And yet, some instinct, deep in her gut, said they had to hold on just a little longer, that something was still possible, though she couldn't imagine what it might be. Keanu stayed longer than he had intended, captivated by the hidden layers of Daniel's world that were revealing themselves with every sentence. The shelves around them were a testament to decades of quiet persistence. Rows of dog-eared screenplays, half-filled journals, and fading Polaroids of sets long dismantled. There was even a cracked leather binder labeled "Ideas Worth Saving," filled with scribbled loglines for films that had never been made. Daniel's fingers brushed over them, as though they were old friends he still hoped to see again. "Most people think Hollywood forgets you overnight," Daniel said quietly, his voice almost lost in the dusty hush of the room. "But the truth is, you start forgetting yourself first, bit by bit. You stop calling directors, stop showing up to screenings, stop reading the trades. One day you wake up, and the world has moved on, and you didn't even notice when it left." Keanu swallowed the lump, forming in his throat. He thought of his own moments of doubt, the years when grief had almost consumed him, when every set felt like borrowed time. The difference was, he had made it back to the light. Daniel had been left behind, in the shadows. But there was still something in him. Keanu saw it in the way Daniel's eyes glimmered when he talked about stories, in the way his hands unconsciously framed the air as if directing invisible scenes. That spark, the one that made artists endure rejection and hardship, hadn't died. It was just buried under layers of dust, like everything else in this house. "Daniel," Keanu said finally, his tone steady but gentle, "you didn't lose everything. You're still here. That matters." Daniel smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Being here isn't the same as being alive, Keanu. Not really." The words hung in the air like a lingering echo. Keanu let the silence stretch, sensing that any rushed response would break the fragile trust that had formed between them. He wanted to reach across the gulf of years and loss and pull Daniel back, but he knew that couldn't happen in a single afternoon. Instead, he stood and walked slowly around the room, letting his fingers graze the edges of Daniel's forgotten past. He paused at a faded photo pinned to a corkboard. A much younger Daniel on set, wearing a headset and grinning, with a young Keanu standing beside him, beaming with unguarded joy. The sight struck Keanu like a jolt to the heart. He turned back, voice softer now. Maybe it's not too late to find your way back. Not to what was, but to something new. Daniel looked at him, truly looked, as if measuring the weight of those words. For the first time, his eyes didn't look quite so hollow. Keanu knew then that a door had cracked open just barely, but enough for light to begin seeping in. As the evening program resumed, the stage lights dimmed to a golden glow, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor of the Willow Glen Auditorium. Tables had been pushed aside for the silent auction, and guests wandered among the displays with glasses of champagne and murmured conversations. The silver flute rested under its glass case at center stage, catching every flicker of light like a sliver of moon trapped in crystal. Keanu stayed near the back of the room, half in shadow, his hands folded loosely in front of him. He had hoped the focus would remain on the students' work, their art lining the walls in proud splashes of color. But Julian Mercer had other plans. The MC stood at the microphone, grinning as though the night itself were his performance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice booming through the hall. "Before we move on to the final round of bids, I want to draw your attention to a very special item, an heirloom of musical history with quite the Hollywood twist." He gestured theatrically toward the glass display case. The crowd turned as one, murmuring with interest. "This exquisite silver flute," Julian continued, "once belonged to the mother of a man you all know, a man who graced our screens as the stoic hero of blockbusters, the slayer of villains, the master of martial arts choreography, and, apparently, a man who also comes from, shall we say, musical stock." His grin widened. "I'm speaking, of course, about our distinguished guest tonight, Mr. Keanu Reeves." Applause scattered through the hall. Keanu inclined his head politely but did not step forward. He could already sense where this was heading. Julian's smile carried the faint edge of mischief that had marked his jokes earlier, like a cat about to play with its prey. Julian clapped his hands for attention, his voice rising. "Now, rumor has it that musical talent runs in the family. Patricia Taylor played this very instrument in her Toronto days, and tonight it sits here, waiting for a new home. But wouldn't it be something? Wouldn't it be unforgettable if her son could give us just a hint of what might be in those genes?" A ripple of laughter coursed through the crowd, some indulgent, some uneasy. Julian leaned toward the microphone, eyes glittering. "Come on, Keanu. You're an actor, not a musician. But let's see if the genes pass down. Just one note. For the children. For charity." The words hung in the air, like a dare. Several guests turned in their seats to look at Keanu, their expressions caught between curiosity and embarrassment. A few students near the side of the stage went still, their sheet music forgotten on their laps. Keanu remained still, his expression unreadable. He felt no anger, only the weight of a moment tightening around him like drawn strings. Keanu sat with Tony in the dimly lit garage, surrounded by the scent of motor oil and old leather. The hum of a small desk fan filled the silence as Tony carefully spread the documents out on a workbench. The papers were aged and fragile, their corners yellowed and curled. Some were official military records, while others were personal letters written in a hurried, cramped script. Keanu leaned closer, his eyes scanning the faded ink as though trying to absorb the story through sheer will. "These were given to me by one of the guys from my unit," Tony said softly, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to echo through the garage. "He kept them hidden for years. Thought it was safer that way." Keanu nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on a photograph tucked between two reports. It was black and white, showing a group of young men in combat fatigues, their faces smeared with dirt, but lit by the wild grins of survival. In the back row, barely visible, stood a man. Keanu recognized instantly his father, Gerard. The sight hit him like a punch to the chest. He hadn't expected to see his father's face. Here, in this forgotten place, among these ghosts, Tony watched Keanu's reaction with quiet understanding. "Your dad was just a kid," he said. "We all were. We didn't think about medals or recognition back then. We just wanted to make it home." Keanu's throat tightened. He carefully picked up the photograph, holding it as though it might dissolve in his hands. This is proof," he murmured. "Proof that you were there, that you saved them." Tony gave a weary half-smile. "Proof doesn't mean much if no one's willing to see it." Keanu set the photo down and looked at him, determination hardening in his expression. "Then we'll make them see it." Tony chuckled, a sound without joy. "You don't understand how the system works. The military doesn't hand out medals just because someone says you deserve one. They need reports, witnesses, chains of command paper trails that don't always exist." "Then we'll find them," Keanu replied firmly. "Every report, every witness, someone out there remembers what you did. We just have to find them." Tony looked away, as though the very idea was too painful to entertain. "It's been decades. Most of them are gone. And the ones who aren't, they've moved on. Maybe I should too." But Keanu leaned forward, his voice quiet but intense. "You gave them their lives back. My father's life. If not for you, I might never have been born. This isn't about chasing glory, Tony. It's about giving the truth its place." Tony's eyes glistened in the low light, and for a moment he said nothing. Then he let out a long breath, shoulders sagging. "All right," he whispered. "If you're really willing to do this, I'll try." Keanu nodded, a quiet promise forming in his heart. This was just the beginning. Keanu stayed behind long after the volunteers had packed up and the guests had gone home, standing in the quiet cafeteria as the smell of soup and disinfectant lingered in the air. The room felt strangely still, without the buzz of voices, almost hollow. His hands were shoved deep in his coat pockets, and his eyes drifted over the row of metal chairs lined neatly against the wall. Earlier, those same chairs had been filled with laughter and stories, but now they sat empty, like silent witnesses to something sacred that had happened. He replayed the afternoon in his mind, piece by piece. The old veteran who showed him a dog-eared photograph of his squad from 50 years ago. The young mother, barely out of her teens, who whispered that the meal was her first one all day. The man named Ray, who had once worked as a carpenter but lost everything after an injury, and who still said thank you for the chance to serve soup. And above all, Tony moving slowly but steadily, shaking hands, asking names, smiling that small, tired smile, like it mattered more than anything to him. Keanu had seen many faces in his lifetime, but Tony's carried something different. It wasn't just kindness, it was duty, worn into him like an old scar. The thought lodged itself in Keanu's chest. Tony didn't just help people. He carried them. Quietly. Without asking for thanks. Without ever saying how heavy it had become. Keanu walked back into the kitchen. The floor was wet from mopping, and the stainless steel counters gleamed under the flickering fluorescent light. He picked up the dish towel someone had left behind and began drying the last few trays. The small, mindless motion gave his thoughts space to settle. He realized that he hadn't just come here out of curiosity. He had been looking for something he just hadn't known what. Now he did. He wanted to understand Tony. The man's humility wasn't ordinary. It wasn't the kind of humility people wear like a badge for others to see. It was bone deep. It came from somewhere buried far in the past, a place where pain had been endured and left unspoken. And Keanu felt an ache of recognition, because he knew what it meant to carry silent grief, to live with wounds you never name out loud. He dried the last tray and set it aside, then stood still, listening. The shelter had gone silent. Somewhere in the distance, a single door slammed and an old heater kicked on with a shuddering groan. Keanu exhaled slowly. He knew he would be back. This wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning. As he left the building, he glanced back through the glass door. The cafeteria lights cast a warm glow across the empty tables, and for a moment he imagined Tony there again, ladling soup with that quiet, stubborn dignity. The image lingered as Keanu stepped into the cold night air. He zipped his coat, shoved his hands deeper into his pockets, and walked to his car with a new resolve forming quietly inside him. He would return, not just to visit, but to learn who Tony Herrera truly was. The first breath left his lips like a secret he had held for years. A single note rose from the silver flute, thin at first, trembling on the edge of breaking, then finding its shape in the quiet air. It was soft and mournful, yet warm, like a sigh wrapped in sunlight. The sound seemed to come not just from the instrument, but from somewhere older, buried deep in his memory. Keanu kept his eyes down, not looking at the audience or at Julian's frozen smile. He wasn't playing for them. He was playing for someone who wasn't here. The melody unfolded slowly, each note stepping lightly after the last. It was the old Canadian folk tune his mother had hummed while she worked on costumes in their cramped Toronto apartment. She had never sung it loudly, only under her breath, as if it was something precious that might disappear if spoken too boldly. Back then, Keanu would sit at the kitchen table sketching comic book heroes, and the rhythm of her tune had slipped into his drawings, winding around the ink lines like invisible threads. He had not heard it in years, not like this, not alive in the air. Yet his fingers remembered, his breath remembered, and now the flute remembered too. A hush spread through the hall, rippling outward like the hush that follows snowfall. Even the faint clinking of cutlery from the catering table stopped. The stage lights burned pale around him, and beyond them, the crowd became a blur of shadowed faces, watching, but forgotten. All that existed was the line of the melody. It curved gently, dipping and lifting, like the flight of a bird skimming the surface of a still lake. Keanu felt the weight of the instrument, its cool silver against his fingertips, and beneath it the ghost weight of his mother's hands, as though she were guiding him still. Talia, standing among the student musicians at the side of the stage, felt something stir inside her chest. She had never heard a flute sound like this. It wasn't loud or showy, and yet it filled the entire space. It felt older than the polished wood floors beneath her feet. Without thinking, she raised her violin. The bow hovered over the strings for a breath. Then she slid into a soft harmony beneath his line, barely touching the melody, just shading it. Her tone quivered, hesitant at first, but when Keanu's eyes flicked toward her and he gave the faintest nod, her confidence steadied like a candle shielded from wind. One by one, the others followed. A cello, deep and hushed, joined like a heartbeat under the melody. A viola eased in beside Talia's line, warm and husky. The students looked at one another as if to ask permission, then simply surrendered to it, letting their instruments speak. They were no longer sight-reading from the score that had been abandoned backstage. They were chasing something they could only feel. The air seemed to thicken with sound, layered and luminous. It was as if they were not creating music, but remembering it together, pulling it from some hidden place where it had been waiting all along. Keanu stayed up most of that night, in the quiet glow of the guest house, reading through Marcus's worn notebooks. They were filled with sketches of motorcycles, stray song lyrics, and fragments of poems written in rushed, blocky handwriting. Some pages were smeared where rain or tears had blurred the ink. The words carried a rawness that shook Keanu a glimpse into a soul that had been clawing for meaning while the world turned its back. In one notebook, Marcus had written a single line over and over: "I'm more than what I've done." That phrase gripped Keanu's heart. He knew what it was like to be judged by moments rather than the whole of who you are. Fame had magnified every misstep he ever made, but at least he'd had chances to grow beyond them. Marcus had never been given that grace. The next morning, Keanu drove Marcus to a quiet overlook above the city. The sky was streaked with orange and pale gold as the sun broke through thinning clouds. The city below shimmered like an unreachable world, distant and indifferent. Marcus stood at the railing, shoulders tense, fists shoved in his jacket pockets. He didn't say anything, and Keanu didn't push. After a while, Keanu spoke softly. "You know, people will always have their opinions, but they don't define who you are. Only you get to do that." Marcus kept staring at the horizon. What if who I am is just broken? Keanu let the silence stretch. Then he replied, "Being broken isn't the end. It's just where rebuilding starts." Marcus's eyes flicked toward him, wary but curious, like a man trying to believe in something too fragile to touch. Keanu continued, "I can't erase what's behind you, but I can walk beside you in what's ahead. You don't have to carry it alone anymore." For the first time, Marcus's posture softened. His jaw unclenched, and his shoulders lowered slightly as if a weight had shifted. He exhaled a long, shaky breath. "I don't even know where to start," he admitted. "Start small," Keanu said gently. "A day at a time, one right choice at a time." They stayed there for a long while, not talking, just breathing the cold morning air. There was no grand breakthrough, no dramatic transformation. But something subtle had changed, like the first crack of light through a boarded window. Marcus wasn't ready to believe in himself yet, but for the first time, he was willing to let someone else believe in him. When they returned to the guest house, Marcus lingered near the door, as if unsure whether to stay or flee. Keanu placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're safe here," he said simply. Marcus nodded once. It was small, but it was real. And for Keanu, that tiny spark of willingness meant everything. It was the fragile beginning of trust, and he knew how rare and precious that was. Keanu's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the worn photograph he had found tucked inside the yearbook. It was a black and white snapshot of the drama club's cast standing on the school auditorium stage. Tony was there, his posture tall, his grin impossibly wide, and his arm draped around a younger boy who looked so much like a teenage version of Keanu's father that it made his chest tighten. The sight of them together, carefree and full of hope, pierced through the years like an arrow. For a moment, Keanu saw not just two teenagers, but the thin, fragile thread of fate that had tied their lives together long before war would unravel them. He held the photograph like it was something sacred. Around him, the library felt impossibly quiet. The ticking of the wall clock grew loud in the silence, syncing with the thump of his heart. He imagined Tony as a 17-year-old, rehearsing lines, joking with friends, unaware that the shadow of Vietnam War would soon loom over his future. Keanu's breath hitched as he realized how easily Tony could have taken a different path: college, theater, a peaceful life, if not for the draft pulling him away. Keanu carefully placed the photo on the table and opened the yearbook again, tracing his finger down the list of names. There it was: Anthony Herrera, drama club, track team, future plans, theater arts. The words hit him like a quiet tragedy. Theater arts. Tony had once dreamed of the stage, the very world that had given Keanu his purpose and his voice. Yet while Keanu had stepped into that world and thrived, Tony had been pulled into jungles and firefights. The unfairness of it ached inside his chest. He flipped through more pages, collecting fragments of Tony's youth, a mention in a track meet article, a photo of him holding a trophy, a candid shot of him laughing in the cafeteria. Each glimpse added weight to the image of who Tony had been, a vibrant soul full of promise. Keanu wondered how many people even remembered this version of him. How many had mourned what was lost when he returned from Vietnam, not as the boy in the photos, but as the quiet, overlooked man he had become. Keanu gently closed the yearbook and sat back in his chair, staring at the photograph on the table. It wasn't just an old picture anymore. It was evidence, a testament to the life Tony had lived before the war had taken it from him. Keanu knew now, with unwavering certainty, that Tony's story deserved to be told. Not just the story of a soldier who vanished into obscurity, but the story of a young man who had once burned with dreams, who had saved lives including his father's and been forgotten. Keanu would not let that stand. The last echoes of the traditional melody faded like mist, and for a heartbeat, the auditorium seemed to hold its breath with him. Keanu let the final note rest in the rafters, then drew in a slow breath, angling the flute just slightly. He let his fingers wander, not toward a known song, but toward something half-remembered, half-born in that moment. The first notes were soft, hesitant, almost like footsteps on unfamiliar ground. They drifted out over the stillness, tentative but alive, weaving threads of curiosity through the air. The orchestra students glanced at each other. They had been following him through the folk tune. But this was something new. The sheet music on their stands no longer held any answers. Keanu shaped another phrase, warmer, this time, dipping into a minor key and then back up, his breath steady. It was as if he were telling a story without words, and the room leaned in to listen. The timpanist shifted his mallets in his hands. The clarinetist blinked and then slowly raised her instrument, adding a faint, wavering line beneath the flute's rise. Keanu's eyes softened, almost a smile, and he turned slightly toward the students without missing a note. He lowered the volume, creating space. The sound was an open door, and one by one, the young musicians began to step through it. A quiet thread of strings curled into the space. The violas entered with careful grace, brushing the edges of his melody like watercolor bleeding across paper. Keanu let their sound bloom, responding with delicate arpeggios that danced above them like glints of light on water. Talia's bow hovered, her dark eyes fixed on him. She felt the current pulling her forward, and though her heart thudded in her chest, she lifted her violin and answered him. Her first note cut like a silver ribbon through the air, clean and sure. Keanu's flute caught her phrase and twisted it gently, handing it back. She breathed with the bow, her tone brightening, growing stronger. The orchestra stirred around them, like a field of wildflowers, leaning toward the Sunday. The cellist, the shy one who had spent the night trying to disappear behind the taller players, swallowed hard. His fingers trembled as he placed them on the strings. He drew his bow and released a single deep, resonant note that rolled through the hall like the earth itself had spoken. Heads turned. The note lingered, trembling in the bones of the building. Keanu let the silence after it stretch just enough to honor its weight, then answered with a low, breathy tone from the flute, binding the sound to his. Talia caught the cellist's eyes and gave him the smallest nod. Something inside him seemed to uncoil. He played again, this time a pair of notes, rich and glowing. The orchestra shifted subtly, making room for his voice. Keanu wove around him, his melody curling like smoke, coaxing, encouraging, lifting. Keanu sat slumped in the corner of the sterile hospital waiting room, his hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles had gone white. The world outside those glass doors kept spinning, oblivious, while his own felt like it had come to a grinding halt. Every sound was amplified: the distant ding of an elevator, the shuffle of nurses' shoes, the steady hum of fluorescent lights. It all pressed in on him, like the walls were closing closer with every passing minute. He couldn't stop replaying the doctor's words in his head. The relapse was aggressive. The treatment wasn't working the way they'd hoped. If they couldn't find a compatible donor soon, Kim Reeves might not survive the month. That single sentence had hollowed him out, like someone had scooped the breath from his chest and left nothing but panic behind. For so long, Keanu had managed to hold himself together, smiling when she needed reassurance, cracking jokes to keep her spirits up, swallowing his own fear so it wouldn't poison hers. But now, with the weight of those words still hanging in the air, he felt the first real fracture in his resolve. He thought about how small she had looked lying in that bed, her once bright eyes dulled with exhaustion, and a flash of anger shot through him so fierce it startled him. Not at her, not at anyone really, just at the unfairness of it all. Kim had always been the fighter, the stubborn one, when they were kids. She was the one who dared him to climb the tallest trees, to dive into waves that towered over them. She never backed down from anything. And now, her body was betraying her, dragging her into a fight she hadn't chosen. It felt like the cruelest kind of betrayal. Keanu pressed the heels of his palms into his eyes, trying to block out the helplessness clawing at him. He wasn't used to feeling powerless. He had spent his whole life fixing things, solving problems, pushing through obstacles with relentless focus. But this was different. This wasn't something he could work harder at. This wasn't a role he could master or a challenge he could train for. This was his sister's life slipping through his fingers, and no amount of effort could guarantee he could catch her. A choked breath escaped his lips, almost a sob, but he swallowed it down hard. The waiting room was empty, but still, he couldn't let go completely. He feared that if he cracked open even a little, everything inside would pour out and never stop. He rose from the chair and started pacing, each step sharp and controlled, trying to force his body into motion to silence the storm in his mind. He needed something, anything, to do. A plan, a task, a way to fight back. He knew if he stayed still, he would drown in the what-ifs, and so he clung to the one thread of hope the doctors had given him: a donor. Somewhere out there, someone had the match that could save Kim, and if it was the last thing he did, he would find them. The silence that followed was unbearable. The room seemed to shrink, walls pressing in on Keanu Reeves as he stared at the grainy footage on Marcus's cracked phone screen. There was his half-brother, hunched and gaunt, pacing in his cell like a caged animal. The guard had recorded it during rounds, apparently thinking it funny, Marcus muttering to himself, clutching a scrap of paper as though it were a lifeline. The sight cut deeper than Keanu expected. This wasn't just a man serving time. This was someone unraveling. Keanu's throat tightened. The anger that had simmered in Marcus's voice during their last call now made sense. He wasn't just bitter, he was drowning. And somehow, Keanu felt like he was holding the rope that could pull him back or let him sink forever. That realization made his chest ache in a way he couldn't ignore anymore. He leaned back, rubbing his temples, trying to push away the image of Marcus's hollow eyes. But they stayed, burned into his mind like a brand. He thought of his own life premieres, interviews, long motorcycle rides under open skies. Marcus had none of that, just gray walls and the echo of his own thoughts. The next morning, Keanu drove aimlessly through Los Angeles, the city buzzing obliviously around him. He passed billboards with his face on them, strangers snapping photos as he idled at a stoplight. But none of it touched him. His heart wasn't there. It was trapped in that concrete cell miles away, with the brother he barely knew, but couldn't stop thinking about. Finally, he pulled into a quiet overlook high above the city. The skyline stretched like a glittering ocean beneath him, but he felt no awe, just a crushing weight of responsibility. He sat there for hours, hands slack on the steering wheel. As the sun bled into the horizon, the wind whispered through the open window, carrying the distant hum of life below. It all felt so fragile. And for the first time, Keanu admitted to himself he was scared of failing Marcus, of arriving too late, of seeing him break beyond repair. As night settled, he opened the glove compartment and pulled out the folded letter Marcus had sent months ago, the one he'd never answered. The paper was worn from being read too often, edges soft, creased like old fabric. Marcus's handwriting slanted and messy, but every word was raw. "I don't know why I'm writing. Maybe I just want to know if someone out there still thinks I'm worth saving," Keanu closed his eyes. His answer was silent, but absolute. He couldn't let Marcus become another ghost in his life. Too many of those already haunted him. This time, he would not walk away. With a trembling breath, he tucked the letter back into his jacket. Tomorrow, he would go back to the prison, not as a distant benefactor or a guilty stranger, as a brother who refused to give up. The final note lingered in the air like a ghost of breath, hovering on the edge of silence before dissolving into stillness. The room stood suspended, no one daring to move, as if the entire audience had been holding their collective breath without realizing it. Keanu Reeves slowly lowered the flute, the silver body glinting softly under the stage lights, and he could feel the faint tremor still running through his fingers. He had not played to impress them. He had played to remember, and somehow they had all felt it too. The last hum of vibration faded into the rafters, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to hold itself perfectly still. Then the silence broke. It shattered not with a whisper or a hesitant clap, but with an eruption applause surging forward like a wave crashing on shore. It started near the center, a single pair of hands clapping loudly, then another joined, then another, until the entire auditorium roared with it. People rose to their feet in one motion, like they had been pulled up by invisible strings. The sound swelled, echoing off the old wood beams of the school auditorium, filling every corner with thunder. Students gasped, then laughed, then grinned at one another in wide-eyed disbelief. They had done it. They had made something real, and everyone could feel it. Keanu stood still for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. He didn't smile in triumph. He just breathed it in, a quiet presence at the center of a storm. Then he turned slightly and gestured toward the students with an open hand, inviting the crowd to see them instead. The young musicians glanced at one another, hesitant at first, then slowly stepped forward. A ripple of laughter and cheers met them as they lined up across the front of the stage, some still clutching their instruments like lifelines. The applause only grew louder. The shy cellist blushed furiously as the girl beside him gave his arm a playful shove, urging him to bow. He did, stiffly, and the crowd cheered even louder. Talia was trembling as she dipped into her bow, the violin still warm in her hands. She lifted her head and looked out at the sea of faces, and for the first time that night she looked genuinely proud. Her usual cautious reserve had melted away, replaced by something bright and unguarded. She caught Keanu's eye for just a moment and gave a small nod of thanks, almost imperceptible, but he saw it. He answered with a soft nod of his own, stepping a little further back so the spotlight could find her instead. Near the edge of the stage, Principal Dorsey stood frozen, her hands clasped to her chest as if she were physically holding in her emotions. Tears shimmered in her eyes, catching the light, but she made no move to wipe them away. Around her, a few teachers openly cried. Others clapped furiously through their tears. None of them seemed able to believe what they had just witnessed, and yet none of them would ever forget it. Keanu gently turned the fragile page, his breath catching as he realized this wasn't just a scrapbook. It was a timeline of Marcus's life, built out of fragments no one else had bothered to collect. One corner held a child's crayon drawing of a stick figure family with the word "someday" scrawled in crooked letters. Below it was a photo of a young Marcus standing awkwardly in front of a dilapidated group home. His expression caught somewhere between defiance and hope. Keanu felt an ache build in his chest as he studied that face, the boy who never had anyone waiting for him, yet had somehow grown into the man who risked everything to protect others behind prison walls. He moved on, and the pages became darker. Newspaper clippings of petty theft arrests, court dates, and mugshots appeared between the cheerful scraps. But even those were annotated in Marcus's cramped handwriting, with words like, "I wanted to help her," or "I didn't know what else to do." There was no anger in the writing, only desperation. Keanu could almost hear the silence Marcus must have returned to after each mistake, the way the world probably never asked why before locking the door on him. The scrapbook didn't excuse what Marcus had done, but it explained the pain behind it, and somehow that mattered. Midway through the book, the tone shifted again. There were photos of prison gardens, small bursts of green against concrete. Keanu noticed a pressed flower taped between two pages, labeled with Marcus's careful script, "Grew this with Carlos." First thing I ever kept alive. There were pictures of stray cats sunbathing near the prison yard, and even a blurry Polaroid of Marcus laughing during a literacy class. Keanu found himself smiling faintly, imagining his half-brother, this man he'd once thought of only as a stranger, nurturing tiny seedlings and reading children's books to other inmates. The kindness in those moments felt like a quiet rebellion against the life Marcus had been handed. Then Keanu reached the final section. Here, the pages were sparse, but each one struck like a blow. Letters Marcus had written but never sent were tucked into an envelope. Keanu slid one out and unfolded it. The handwriting was steadier than before, as if Marcus had found a kind of peace while writing it. "I don't know if you'll ever read this, Keanu. I don't even know if you'd want to. But if you do, I need you to know, I'm not asking for anything. Not forgiveness. Not even a meeting. I just wanted you to know you had a brother who watched your movies from behind bars and felt proud. You gave me hope on nights I didn't think I'd see the morning. That's all. Marcus." Keanu sat there for a long time, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. He felt his throat tighten, his heart both breaking and swelling at once. Marcus hadn't written these words to be found. He had written them because he needed to say them, even if no one ever listened. And somehow, against all odds, Keanu was listening now. He closed the scrapbook gently, as though it were something sacred. The silence in the little apartment seemed different now, less hollow, more like a pause in a song waiting to be continued. Keanu knew in his bones that this wasn't the end of Marcus's story. It was only the place where it had been left unfinished. The applause had not yet faded when Keanu stepped forward, the silver flute still resting gently in his hand. The students were still glowing from their shared performance, their bows and smiles trembling with adrenaline. Principal Dorsey lingered near the curtain, wiping his glasses with a trembling hand, his eyes shining. Even Julian stood frozen, uncertain whether to speak or stay silent. Keanu turned to the crowd, waiting until the room's energy softened from thunderous applause to quiet anticipation. Only then did he lift the microphone from its stand, holding it not as a prop, but as though it were a delicate promise. He paused, letting the silence settle. When he spoke, his voice carried low and steady, threaded with something softer than pride and stronger than hesitation. "This flute," he said, his thumb brushing the worn silver surface, "belonged to my mother." The words seemed to ripple through the audience, still and attentive. She was a costume designer for theater and film, but before that, she taught music, not for applause, not for praise. She taught music because it gave her and the people she taught peace. Several of the students on stage shifted subtly, as though leaning closer. Keanu glanced toward them before looking back at the crowd. She used to say that music was what reminded her the world could be beautiful, even when it wasn't easy. And I think, his eyes softened, we could all use reminders like that sometimes. There was no theatrical rise in his tone, no flourish, just quiet sincerity that reached the edges of the room like the slow warmth of morning light. People who had been leaning back in their seats now leaned forward, hands resting loosely over their knees. He turned the flute gently in his hand, then set it back on its velvet-lined display stand as though placing it to rest. "Tonight," he continued, "I watched these young musicians pour everything they had into their music, and it tell me of something my mom always believed, that talent isn't enough. It's about being given the chance to find your sound in the first place." A murmur passed through the front rows, quiet and contemplative. Keanu waited until the hush returned before speaking again. "That's why," he said, "I'd like to start something tonight. A fund. In my mother's name. The Patricia Taylor Instrument Fund." A few heads lifted sharply, surprise flashing in their eyes. "We'll give instruments to 100 public schools that don't have the resources to buy them, so that every kid who wants to make music, who needs music, has the chance to try." His tone didn't rise. He simply let the words fall where they would, and their weight landed heavily. Gasps rose around the room, quickly followed by a swell of applause, this one almost sharper than the one that had followed the music. Keanu raised one hand in a small, almost bashful gesture, to quiet the sound. "I'll personally match every donation we raise tonight," he added, and the applause broke out again, louder, scattered cheers threading through it. He smiled faintly. That familiar quiet smile that never asked for attention but somehow always drew it. "Because if we're lucky enough to be here," he said, "we're lucky enough to give someone else a beginning." Keanu stepped forward, the dull thud of his boots against the cracked linoleum echoing like drum beats in the hollow space. Marcus flinched instinctively, his hands balling into trembling fists at his sides. There was defiance in his posture, but it was paper-thin, brittle as dry leaves. One hard breath could shatter it. "Why did you come here?" Marcus muttered, his voice rough as gravel. "To see what a disappointment looks like up close?" Keanu's heart clenched at the bitterness, at the sheer weight of shame packed into those words. "No," he said softly. "I came here because I know what it's like to believe. You're beyond saving." Marcus's eyes flicked up at that, wary, confused. His chest rose and fell quickly, like he was bracing for a blow that never came. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The silence between them was jagged, slicing through the air like glass. "You don't know anything about me," Marcus snapped. "You don't know what I've done." "Then tell me," Keanu said. His tone was calm, almost too calm, and it made Marcus hesitate. There was no judgment in it, only an open door. "Tell me everything." Marcus's throat worked as he swallowed. He looked at the floor, at the peeling paint on the wall, anywhere but Keanu's eyes. "It wasn't supposed to go that far," he whispered finally. I needed money. For her. For Mom. She was sick, and I couldn't pay for anything. So, I ran with the wrong people. Thought I could handle it. Thought I could keep control." His breath hitched. "And then one night things got out of control. Someone got hurt. I didn't mean for it to happen." Keanu felt his chest tighten. He could hear the rawness in Marcus's voice, the desperate edge of a man who had been carrying a boulder of guilt for years. "And you've been carrying that night ever since," he said quietly. Marcus's head jerked up. His eyes were glassy, rimmed with red. "It doesn't matter why I did it. People don't care about the reasons. They just see a criminal, a lost cause." "I don't," Keanu said. The words were simple, steady. They hung in the air like a lifeline. "I see someone who made a terrible choice, and who's paid for it every single day. That doesn't make you beyond redemption." Marcus's lips trembled as he pressed them together, as if trying to trap the surge of emotion clawing its way up. He shook his head. "You shouldn't waste your time on me." "Maybe," Keanu said. "Or maybe you're the reason I was meant to come here." Marcus blinked rapidly, stunned silent. The plain weight of those words seemed to reach past the walls Marcus had built around himself, slipping into the hollow space beneath. He looked at Keanu like he was seeing him for the first time, not as a distant, untouchable figure, but as someone who understood brokenness and still believed in rebuilding. For the first time since Keanu had arrived, Marcus didn't look like a cornered animal. He just looked tired and deeply human. Julian stayed hidden behind the heavy black curtain, his back pressed against the cool concrete wall. The roar of applause from the auditorium still rattled through the stage boards, but it felt like it was coming from another world. He stared down at his hands. They were shaking. Not from anger this time, not from the heat of competition or the thrill of being the center of attention. They trembled from something far older and deeper, something he had spent years burying beneath arrogance and control: shame. It was strange how quickly the mask had cracked. One moment he had been preparing another clever line to reclaim the spotlight, and the next he had seen Keanu standing there, not basking in praise, not triumphant, just quietly radiant as he stepped back and let the students soak up the standing ovation. There had been no gloating, no subtle glance his way as if to say, "I told you so." Only humility, and the kind of still strength Julian had never been able to understand. That image had cut through him like a blade. He clenched his fists until the knuckles whitened, trying to steady the storm of thoughts. His reflection from childhood rose up, sharp and unwelcome. He had once stood on a stage, too, only 12 years old, clutching a scuffed old saxophone with dented brass and peeling lacquer. He remembered the smell of the school auditorium, the faint sourness of old wood polish and dust. He had spent months practicing, slipping out of bed at night to finger the keys under a blanket so his father wouldn't hear. Every note had been a secret act of rebellion, of hope. He had believed that music could carry him somewhere lighter. The night of the audition, he had walked out under the blinding stage lights, heart hammering, hands slick with sweat. He had barely made it through the first phrase when the band director stopped him. A short, sharp laugh had come from the man's mouth, cruel and quick. "You're not ready. You don't have the ear for it. Maybe try something easier," he had said, and then waved him off the stage as if dismissing a nuisance. Julian had frozen, staring at the floor, feeling the heat crawl up his neck while the other kids snickered behind their hands. At home later that night, he had tried to tell his father what had happened. His father hadn't looked up from the newspaper. "Told you not to waste time on that," he had said, voice flat. "Work on something that'll get you somewhere." Julian had stood there holding the saxophone like it was a broken limb, like it was bleeding. His father had turned the page. The sound of the paper crinkling had been louder than anything. Julian had quit music the next day. He had never picked up the saxophone again. He had told everyone it was because sports or theater or debate had taken over his time, because he had found a more fitting passion. But the truth was simpler and far more painful. He had been told he was not enough, and he had believed it. And somewhere deep inside, the wound had never closed. Now, standing backstage decades later, he could feel that boy inside him again. The boy who had wanted to make music. The boy who had been laughed off stage before he had even finished. And tonight, when he had mocked Keanu, it hadn't just been cruelty. It had been jealousy. It had been grief. The announcement of the scholarship spread quickly through the community, and almost overnight, Marcus's name became synonymous with hope. Local newspapers ran stories about the foundation, highlighting the incredible journey of a man who had once been forgotten behind prison walls and was now building bridges for others to cross. Teachers from nearby schools reached out, asking how their students could apply. Parents who had quietly feared their children would be pulled into the same cycles of poverty and despair saw a new path open before them. Marcus felt a weight settle on his shoulders, but it wasn't the old weight of shame. This was something new, something heavy, but empowering. It was responsibility. He had become more than just a survivor of his past. He had become a guide, a symbol of what redemption could look like. And yet, he knew that symbols only mattered if they stood for something real, something sustained by hard work. Late at night, Marcus would sit in the small office space Keanu had rented for him. He'd study the files of scholarship applicants, reading their stories with quiet reverence. Some had grown up in foster care. Others had parents struggling with addiction or poverty. Many reminded him of himself, kids who had made mistakes but still held sparks of potential waiting to be fanned into flame. He refused to let the foundation become just another formality or photo opportunity. Each name represented a soul trying to climb out of the darkness, and he would treat them with the dignity they deserved. Keanu visited often, slipping in quietly, never wanting attention for what he had helped fund. He would stand behind Marcus, reading over his shoulder, and sometimes they'd just sit in silence together, the only sound the soft shuffle of papers. Those quiet moments said more than words ever could. Keanu didn't see Marcus as someone he had saved. He saw him as an equal, now a man walking his own path with strength. One evening, as they closed up the office, Marcus turned to him with a rare glimmer of vulnerability. "I used to think my life was about erasing my past," he said, "but now I see it's about transforming it. I can't change where I've been, but maybe I can change where others are going." Keanu's eyes softened with pride. "That's exactly what you're doing," he replied simply. Those words lingered with Marcus. They became the quiet mantra that carried him through the long hours of building something lasting. He knew it would take years before the full impact of the foundation could be measured. But he also knew that every journey started with a single step, and he had finally taken his, not in chains or shame, but in purpose. For the first time, Marcus felt like he wasn't just living day to day. He was planting something that would outlive him, something good, something worthy. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of trimmed hedges and soft garden soil. Lanterns glowed faintly along the winding paths, their light trembling with each breeze. Keanu walked slowly, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, listening to the faint hum of conversation still drifting from the hall behind him. The applause had faded, the crowd had begun to disperse, and the night was reclaiming its silence. Out among the roses and ivy, he spotted a lone figure seated on a stone bench near the fountain. Julian sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the rippling water with vacant eyes. Keanu stopped a few paces away, studying him. There was no trace now of the slick confidence that had marked Julian's presence earlier in the night. The spotlight arrogance was gone, replaced by something hollow and frayed. Keanu took a few careful steps closer, his shoes crunching gently over the gravel, and sat down on the far end of the bench. Julian didn't look up. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the soft splash of the fountain. "You weren't wrong," Keanu said quietly. His voice was calm, steady. "You were hurt." Julian's shoulders twitched at the sound, as if the words struck something he had tried to keep buried. Slowly, he turned his head to glance at Keanu, his face pale in the lantern light. There was confusion there, and shame, and a thin thread of longing that looked almost like relief. "Hurt," he repeated, as if testing the word on his tongue. Keanu nodded gently. "That kind of hurt can make us lash out, try to make others feel small so we don't feel so small ourselves." Julian let out a soft, bitter laugh and shook his head. "I was awful," he whispered. "Tonight, I was God. I don't even know what I was trying to prove." He rubbed his face with both hands, dragging them down slowly, as if trying to peel off the mask he had worn for so long. "When you played that flute, it was like watching everything I've lost walk past me." Keanu stayed silent, giving him room to speak. Julian swallowed hard, then exhaled shakily. "I wanted to be a musician once," he admitted. "A saxophonist. I was just a kid. I used to practice in my room until my lips went numb. It was the only time I ever felt whole, like I mattered." His voice cracked on the last word, and he blinked quickly, trying to hold himself together. "My father told me it was a waste of time," Julian went on. "Said music wouldn't put food on the table, and my music teacher, he told me I'd never be good enough. So I stopped. I threw it all away, and I pretended I didn't care. I told myself I was meant for bigger things. But all I really did was run from the one thing that made me feel alive." Keanu listened without interruption, his gaze soft, his posture open and unjudging. Keanu remained seated at the old wooden table in Margaret's kitchen, the envelope now lying open before him like a doorway to another world. The first page had revealed fragments of her past, but the second sheet carried something far more intimate. A confession, written in trembling cursive, as if each word cost her strength she no longer had. "My dearest Keanu," it began, "if you are reading this, it means I am no longer there to tell you in person what I have carried in my heart for decades. I was not just your nanny. I was once the young woman who stood outside your family's house every morning before dawn, praying you would have a better life than I did." His throat tightened. He could almost see her standing outside their old home in Toronto, bundled in a faded coat, waiting for the lights to come on inside. She had been more than a caretaker, she had been a silent guardian. And now, her letter spoke like a voice from the shadows of his childhood. "I had lost my own child before I met you," the letter continued. "She was only 3 months old when illness took her from me." The letter fun. "Grief hollowed me out. I thought I would never feel joy again. Then, your mother hired me. The first time I held you, you smiled in your sleep, and something inside me began to heal." Keanu's eyes blurred. He remembered countless nights when Margaret had rocked him through fevers, whispered lullabies as storms rattled the windows, and wiped away his tears without saying a word. She had given him comfort without demanding anything in return. Now he knew why. She had loved him as though he were the child she lost. "You were so full of light. You reminded me that love is not bound by blood. It can be chosen. It can be fierce and enduring, even when the world tries to break it." His breath trembled, as he folded the letter halfway, then opened it again, unable to stop reading. Margaret had carried this pain and love alone all those years, never telling anyone, not even him. She had buried her grief beneath her tenderness, and it had shaped every kindness she ever gave him. "I am proud of the man you became," she wrote. "Every film you made, every smile you gave, every act of kindness I saw in the news I watched from afar and felt like a mother seeing her child flourish. I never needed recognition. Knowing you lived with compassion was enough." A tear slipped down his cheek, then another. He pressed his palm to the paper as if he could reach through time and hold her hand. The room felt still, almost sacred. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft tick of the clock, even the shifting sunlight through the curtains seemed to pause, giving space for her words to settle in his heart. Keanu realized that this letter was not only her farewell, it was her way of giving him back every moment of love she had poured into him, so he would know it had always been real. The morning sun slanted through the tall windows of Willow Glen's rehearsal hall, scattering golden rectangles across. The polished wood floor, the faint hum of tuning instruments filled the air, violins tracing scales, a cello humming softly, percussion tapping out test rhythms. It was a week after the gala, and though the excitement of that night had faded, the students' spirits carried a new energy. Their music seemed lighter, brighter, as if the memory of that unexpected performance with Keanu had awakened something in them. At the back of the hall, the heavy doors creaked open. Julian stepped inside, clutching a battered saxophone case that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Dust streaked the corners, and the handle was frayed, but he carried it carefully, almost reverently. His suit was gone. He wore jeans and a plain shirt, his posture unguarded. For once, he didn't stride in expecting attention. He slipped into the room quietly, like a guest, unsure if he belonged. The students noticed immediately. Talia lowered her bow mid-phrase, her eyebrows rising. Marcus, the percussionist, elbowed the shy cellist, who nearly dropped his bow in surprise. The chatter stilled as all eyes turned toward Julian. For a heartbeat, he thought about turning back, retreating to the safety of his car. But then he caught the faint reflection of himself in the window, not the slick MC, not the fading sitcom star, but a man carrying something real. He straightened, swallowed hard, and set the case down. Julian cleared his throat, his voice rough. "I used to play, a long time ago." His hand lingered on the case, as if it might burn him. "Thought maybe I could try again, if you don't mind." For a moment, no one moved. Then Talia tilted her head, her lips quirking into the smallest smile. "We'd like that," she said softly. The room shifted, the tension easing. The other students nodded, curiosity brightening their faces. Julian knelt and unlatched the case. The saxophone inside bore the marks of time scratches along the bell, tarnish dulling the brass. But when he lifted it, the weight felt familiar. His fingers hovered over the keys, trembling. He pressed his lips to the mouthpiece and released a single note. It cracked, wavered, and fell flat. The kids winced. Julian laughed, shaking his head. "Guess I'm a little rusty." "No worries," said Marcus, tapping his drumsticks together. "So are we half the time." Laughter rippled through the room. The ice had broken. Julian tried again. This time the note came cleaner, carrying a soft, smoky warmth. He followed it with another, then another, weaving a hesitant line that dipped and rose like a memory finding its way back. The students leaned in, their instruments at the ready. Talia lifted her violin and added a gentle harmony, sliding alongside his melody. The cellist joined, deep notes grounding the sound, while the clarinet slipped in with a playful counterpoint. The music began to swell, not perfect, not polished, but alive. Julian's foot tapped instinctively, his shoulders loosening, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in years, he wasn't performing for applause. He was playing because it felt good, because it connected him to the boy he had once been. Keanu happened to be walking the corridor outside the rehearsal hall at that very moment. He had come to Willow Glen to drop off the first batch of instruments purchased through the Patricia Taylor Fund. In his hands, He carried 2 flute cases and a violin, freshly polished, tags still on them. As he passed by the tall glass window of the music room, a familiar tune caught his ear. He slowed. The door was slightly ajar. He didn't push it open. Instead, he stood just outside, letting the music drift toward him. It wasn't a formal piece, more like a conversation in melody. Light, improvised, warm. And right in the center of it was Julian, seated awkwardly on a folding chair, saxophone in hand, completely unaware of the man listening outside. Keanu didn't interrupt. He simply stood there, a quiet smile forming as he watched Julian nod in rhythm with the students. Talia gave a small cue with her bow, and the others followed.
It wasn't the perfection of the notes that made the moment so beautiful, it was the joy. Julian's fingers fumbled once or twice, but he recovered quickly.
His tone wavered in places, yet when the music clicked, it soared. He closed his eyes briefly during one long, breathy phrase, and the room responded with a gentle wave of strings. The kids were watching him, not with judgment, but with encouragement, mirroring back the faith he had long lost in himself. It wasn't about redemption in the big, dramatic sense. It was about trust, trusting himself enough to return, to try again. He wasn't center stage in a grand theater. He was in a schoolroom with mismatched chairs, peeling posters, and teenagers who believed in the beauty of trying. When the piece came to a natural close, no one clapped. They didn't need to. The silence that followed was full and rich, like the echo of something deeply felt. Then someone coughed, and the spell broke with laughter. Talia nudged Julian playfully. "You're in for rehearsal Thursday, right?" Julian raised an eyebrow. Was that an official invite? The percussionist grinned. "Oh, it's very official. You're stuck with us now." Julian chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I think I'd like that." As the students returned to tuning and casual chatter, Julian looked toward the door. But Keanu was already gone, having slipped away unnoticed. He didn't need to be seen. This wasn't about him. It was never about him. He had done what his mother used to do, create a space where people could come back to life through music. Later that day, Principal Dorsey would receive a letter from Keanu, praising the music program and requesting permission to quietly fund an after-school mentorship series where adults in the community could come and rehearse alongside students. Julian would be the first mentor invited to lead a session. Word would spread, slowly at first. Other parents and faculty with dusty guitars and forgotten clarinets would begin showing up, and the music room at Willow Glen would no longer be just a place for students. It would become something more, a place of return, of rediscovery. Julian came back every week. Sometimes he played, sometimes he just listened. But every time, he brought something with him, a softness, a humility, a joy. And he always brought his saxophone. It started with a single clip. A parent seated near the front of the Willow Glen Gala had filmed the moment Keanu Reeves raised the old wooden flute to his lips. There was no fanfare, no formal announcement. Just music, raw, aching, beautiful. Within hours of posting it online with the caption, "Keanu Reeves plays his mother's flute and silences the room," it began to spread. First among local Facebook groups, where teachers, parents, and alumni shared it as a feel-good story. Then it caught the attention of a major education advocate on TikTok. He reposted the clip with a teary-eyed reaction and added, "This is why we fight for music programs in public schools. Just listen." By the next morning, the video had racked up over 2 million views. Comments poured in. One viewer wrote, "I don't even like flutes, but this made me cry at my desk." Another shared, "My mom used to hum that same melody. I hadn't heard it in years." Soon, news outlets were scrambling to get the story. Articles popped up with titles like, "Keanu Reeves silences crowd with a flute at school gala. Actor's surprise performance sparks music ed revival. From mockery to magic. What happened at Willow Glen?" But it wasn't just Keanu's performance that caught fire. It was what came after, his emotional speech, the personal story of his mother Patricia, and the announcement of the instrument fund. That was when Julian stepped into the light again. He had remained quiet for a few days. He hadn't posted, hadn't replied to emails. He was still processing everything, the performance, the redemption, the way Keanu had looked at him with no resentment. But the turning point came when he saw himself in one of the videos from the Gala. A student had recorded him sitting in the hallway afterward holding his saxophone, completely unaware he was being filmed. The caption under the video said, "He found his way back." Julian watched the clip a dozen times. Not because he liked how he looked, he didn't, but because of what it represented. It was him, yes, but it was also every adult who had once held a dream in their hands and let it slip away. That night, Julian sat in his living room and recorded a video. No makeup, no editing. Just him in a hoodie, a cup of tea beside him, and the saxophone resting on the arm of the couch. "I've been in entertainment for a long time," he began. "And in that world, it's easy to lose the quieter parts of yourself, the parts that don't seek applause, the ones that just want to create." He looked directly into the lens. "When I made that joke about Keanu bringing a flute, I thought I was being clever. I thought I was protecting the show. But what I was really doing was hiding my own disappointment. Disappointment that I let music go a long time ago, that I let someone else tell me I wasn't good enough." He paused, steadying his breath. "But last week, I saw something. I saw students who didn't need polish or perfection. They needed a space to be brave. And Keanu gave them that. He gave me that too." He glanced at the saxophone. "I played again. And I plan to keep playing. So to anyone watching this, it's not too late. Whether you were 15 or 50 when you quit, that part of you still remembers." He smiled, soft and honest. "Thank you, Keanu, for reminding me." Julian's video titled "I Was Wrong About the Flute" was posted quietly at first. No PR team, no flashy thumbnail, just truth. But within hours, it exploded across platforms. Viewers weren't expecting an apology, let alone one filled with humility, vulnerability, and a rekindled love for music. That rare authenticity resonated. It struck a chord that algorithms alone could never predict. Comments flooded in. "I gave up violin at 13 when my teacher told me I'd never be good enough. I cried watching this. Julian, you have no idea what this meant. Thank you for being honest. My dad always wanted to play trumpet. I just ordered one online for his birthday." Keanu and Julian didn't just make music, they made space. For all of us. Music teachers from across the country began sharing the Gala clip and Julian's message with their students. In a school in Chicago, a 4th grade teacher played the video and asked, "How does it feel when someone believes in you?" A dozen little hands went up, each with a story to share. On Reddit, a thread titled, "Why I'm Picking My Guitar Back Up After 20 Years" trended for 2 days. Dozens of users posted photos of dusty clarinets, old mandolins, forgotten drumsticks pulled from the backs of closets. The conversation became more than a viral moment. It became a movement. The Patricia Taylor Instrument Fund's website, which had only been live for 48 hours, began crashing from the surge in traffic. Keanu's team quickly scaled up the servers. Donations poured in. Some were large, written in tribute to lost musicians or beloved teachers, but many were small. $10 from a single mom, $5 from a teenager who wrote, "I can't give much, but I believe in this." Keanu had promised to match donations up to 100 public schools. By the end of the week, the fund had surpassed that goal, then doubled it, then kept going. Local stations across the U.S. covered the story. Headlines read, "Actor turns Gala moment into music revival, from flute to fund. Keanu's quiet revolution. One night, one note, one nation listening." But perhaps the most powerful moment came when a morning show aired a short segment featuring a group of middle schoolers in Detroit, gathered in their small music room. The teacher explained that after seeing Keanu's video, one of their students, a boy who had always struggled with confidence, had asked if he could try the flute. They showed a clip of him, eyes closed, holding the instrument gently as he breathed life into the first soft note. In the background, another student whispered, "He's really doing it." The host on the morning show wiped her eyes and said, "I think we all just needed to be reminded. Music doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be real." Back in Los Angeles, Julian walked the quiet hallways of Willow Glen again, this time as a volunteer. He wasn't there for headlines or redemption. He was there to help tune instruments, share stories, and quietly pass on something he once thought he'd lost forever. And outside the rehearsal room, Keanu watched through the window, smiling before turning to leave. His mission wasn't to be seen, it was to restore the unseen. The house hadn't changed much. Keanu stepped into his mother's home, the scent of lavender and aged wood wrapping around him like a familiar shawl. There were books still stacked on the coffee table, faded photographs on the wall, and a blanket folded just so on the armchair. Everything felt still, like the past had chosen to remain exactly where it had always belonged. In his hand, he held the flute, the same one he had played in front of that skeptical crowd, the same one he had carried like a secret, cradled like a memory. Now polished, rethreaded, and recased, the instrument looked alive again. But it wasn't the shine that mattered. It was where it had returned. Patricia was seated near the sun-drenched window, a warm quilt over her lap and a thin book resting in her hands. Her hair had silvered almost completely and her hands moved more slowly now, but when she looked up and saw the flute, her face bloomed. She didn't say a word at first. Keanu lowered himself gently beside her and opened the case. Inside, the keys glinted with the same quiet pride she had once taught him to play with. He placed it in her lap, and for a few seconds, all that moved was the light through the curtains. Her fingers touched the flute like an old friend, hesitant, reverent. Then she lifted it. Keanu watched her posture shift. Her shoulders softened. Her hands adjusted the grip instinctively, and her lips found the embouchure with the same grace she had shown him when he was a boy. Her breath was not as full as it once had been, but the note that emerged was soft and clear, like the whisper of a lullaby through the trees. He didn't interrupt. She played a few bars of a melody he knew well. It had no name, only memory. A song she used to hum when dishes were being dried or when tears had to be wiped away without a word. A melody that asked for nothing but gave everything. He listened, his heart full. When she finished, she looked at him. "They were in awe of your flute," he said quietly. Patricia smiled, the corners of her eyes folding into deep warmth. "It remembered them," she replied. There was a pause, and then, without planning, without speaking, he reached into his coat and pulled out his own flute, the one he'd brought to the school, the one that still carried the breath of that unforgettable performance. He raised it, and Patricia raised hers. They played together. The duet wasn't flawless. Her hands trembled now and then. His tempo was slightly off in parts. But the sound that filled the room didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to be shared. Mother and son, bridging decades with nothing but air and metal, memory and emotion. Outside, the sun shifted slightly across the floorboards. The music lingered long after the notes stopped. They didn't need applause. They had silence and smiles. Patricia reached over and touched his hand. "You know, Keanu, it was never about how well you played," she said. "It was always about how much you gave away when you did." He nodded, emotion catching in his throat. "And you gave it all," she added. Later that week, Keanu's name trended again, not for a movie premiere, not for an action stunt or a viral interview, but for something quieter. A photo had surfaced. It was taken without flash, just outside the window of Patricia's home. A neighbor had noticed the faint music and captured the moment from a respectful distance. Through the glass, two silhouettes could be seen: Keanu Reeves and his mother, flutes in hand, lost in a private duet beneath golden afternoon light. The image spread quickly. Caption after caption tried to name it: a son's tribute, legacy in a breath, music between generations, but no words could fully express what people felt when they saw it. There was a sense of stillness, of something sacred, something untouched by fame or spectacle. And then came the second wave. Photos began appearing from across the country. In dusty gymnasiums, underfunded classrooms, and makeshift rehearsal rooms, children posed proudly with instruments.
Not brand new, but new to them.
Gleaming violins, rethreaded cellos, polished trumpets, flutes packed in refurbished cases with care. Each one bore a tag, gifted by the Patricia Taylor Instrument Fund. At Willow Glen Elementary, Talia stood before a bulletin board, now completely covered in thank you cards. Some were messy crayon scribbles, others heartfelt notes written with surprising maturity.
One card simply read, "I didn't know I loved music until now." Julian was back too, meeting with the PTA to help coordinate instrument deliveries to other districts. He didn't try to take credit.
He didn't speak much during the meetings, but he always brought his saxophone, just in case the kids wanted to jam during breaks. In a Brooklyn school basement, a young girl unzipped her flute case and pulled out an instrument that gleamed in the flickering overhead light. She was no older than 7. Her fingers stumbled at first, but a music teacher knelt beside her, whispering encouragement. "This one belonged to someone who believed in music," he said. "And now it belongs to you." In a small town in Montana, a boy with autism stood on a cafeteria stage, clutching a refurbished violin. He didn't say much, but when the first string vibrated under his bow, his face lit up with a joy so raw that his mother cried into her hands. In California, a marching band in a rural school finally had enough horns for a full brass section. The students wore mismatched uniforms, but they played like professionals, like they had something to prove. And they did. Back at Patricia's home, Keanu sat with her again, showing her the hundreds of photos that had been emailed to the foundation. Kids grinning beside trumpets, school orchestras posing together with a single cello, handwritten notes that simply said, "Thank you, Mr. Reeves." Patricia scrolled through them slowly, her thumb shaking slightly over the screen. "These are yours too," he told her. She looked up. "I didn't expect to matter again," she said softly. Keanu reached over and took her hand. "You never stopped," he said. "Your music just kept going. I just played the next note." She smiled again, and this time, it held something deeper. Not pride, not nostalgia, peace. The final image in that story wasn't Keanu. It wasn't Patricia. It was a little boy in Detroit, standing on a city street corner with a flute in his hand. No sheet music, no audience, just him and a melody he was still learning how to play. And a world that was finally learning how to listen. In the heart of a forgotten town tucked between railroad tracks and aging warehouses, something extraordinary was happening. At Garfield Elementary, a school that had gone years without a functioning music program, the final shipment of instruments from the Patricia Taylor Instrument Fund had just arrived. The boxes sat in the middle of the cafeteria like unopened treasure chests. They weren't flashy, just plain brown crates with labels scrawled in black marker, flutes, violins, drums, clarinet refurbish, and one marked simply, "Mixed handle with heart." The students gathered around, eyes wide, unsure if they were even allowed to touch them. Most of them had only seen instruments in cartoons or YouTube videos. Now, they were real. The room was quiet, the air full of hesitation. Then came Miss Ramsey. The school's art and music teacher, though, for the past 5 years, she'd really only taught finger painting and rhythm claps. She had kept the word music on her door out of hope, not habit. But today, it felt real again. She gave the smallest nod. One by one, the kids approached the crates. No screaming, no rushing, just reverence. A boy named Miguel opened the drum crate. His fingers hovered over the snare like it was made of glass. He tapped it once, then again. Each beat echoed in the cafeteria like a heartbeat, waking up. Beside him, a tall girl named Erica gently pulled a violin from its velvet-lined case. It was heavier than she expected. She turned it in her hands, studying the curve, the worn chin rest. She had no idea how to play it, but something in the weight of it felt familiar, like holding a secret. In the corner stood Grace. She was the shyest in the school. Barely spoke above a whisper, always kept her sleeves pulled past her palms. She had never raised her hand in class, never danced at recess, never sang along during assemblies. But something had drawn her to the crate labeled flutes. She bent down, reached in, and picked one. It was silver, a little tarnished, but beautiful. She held it awkwardly, upside down at first, then sideways. No one laughed, no one teased. Everyone was too absorbed in their own quiet discoveries. Grace lifted the flute to her lips and blew. The sound that came out was not a note. It was sharp, breathy, off-key. She winced and lowered it immediately. But Miss Ramsey stepped closer. "Perfect," she said gently. Grace looked up, confused. Miss Ramsey smiled. "Now keep going." Grace hesitated, then lifted the flute again. This time, the note was longer. Still crooked, still thin. But it carried a breath of courage in it. That was all it took. The room came alive. Miguel tapped a rhythm on the drum, tentative but steady. Erica ran her bow across the strings, producing a sound that was wild and scratchy, but unmistakably music. Another boy began tapping the xylophone keys with the edge of a pencil. A third found a trumpet mouthpiece and buzzed into it, surprised by the vibration. Within minutes, it was chaos, but not the kind that needed to be stopped. It was the beautiful mess of discovery. Sounds clashing, rhythms overlapping, kids laughing, guessing, trying. Not concert hall music, not YouTube-worthy, but joyful, unfiltered, alive. Miss Ramsey didn't stop them. She didn't correct posture or pitch. She simply stepped back and let the room become what it had never been allowed to be. A place for noise, a place for trying, a place for music. Backstage on a film set in Atlanta, the air buzzed with quiet tension. Not the emotional kind, just the everyday churn of cables dragging, lights resetting, crew members moving between takes. But in one corner of the soundstage, seated in a folding chair near the catering table, Keanu Reeves stared at his phone screen. He had just wrapped a particularly intense scene. Makeup still clung to his face. His costume jacket was half off, sleeves rolled up. The world of Hollywood continued around him, but in his earbuds, a completely different world was playing. The video had been sent to him by Miss Ramsey, a simple email with the subject line, "You should see this." It opened with the shaky footage of Garfield Elementary's cafeteria. No stage, no microphones, just kids, instruments, and noise. Keanu watched as Grace, the shy girl with the silver flute, stepped forward again. This time, she played 3 connected notes. Still wobbly, still unsure, but her fingers moved with new confidence. Her classmates clapped. One even jumped up and spun in a goofy circle in celebration. He smiled softly. Another student, a boy in a wheelchair named Alex, used 2 drumsticks to tap on the sides of a cardboard box. His rhythm was offbeat, but joyful. A girl joined in with tambourine shakes, and soon the room became a wild, wonderful mess again. The camera panned to Miss Ramsey, who was leaning against the wall with her hands over her mouth, laughing, crying, unable to speak. Keanu turned the volume up slightly. It wasn't the music that moved him. It was the effort, the fearlessness, the fact that they didn't know the rules yet, and so they didn't worry about breaking them. He glanced down at the flute on the table beside him. Not the original one. That stayed with Patricia now, but a replica he had commissioned quietly, just for moments like this. It traveled with him on shoots, tucked safely in its case, like a private promise. A few feet away, the assistant director called out for reset. Cameras would roll again in 10 minutes. Wardrobe was hovering, ready to patch his jacket. The script supervisor was pacing, marking continuity notes. But Keanu didn't move. He closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw the children. Not polished, not perfect, but unafraid. He thought of what Patricia once told him long ago. Music without permission is the best kind. That's how you know it's real, when nobody asked for it, but it shows up anyway. He opened his eyes again and watched the last seconds of the video. Grace had stopped playing and was now teaching another student how to hold the flute. Her posture was still uncertain, but her smile was not. Behind her, the wall of the cafeteria had been painted with new words in big blue letters. Keanu hadn't seen that part before. It said, "You don't need to be ready, you just need to begin." He stared at it. Then, almost instinctively,
He reached for the replica flute on the table, pulled it from its case, and held it in his lap. He didn't play it. He didn't need to. Just feeling its weight was enough for now. On the screen, the students at Garfield Elementary erupted into cheers as Grace hit a clean note. The video ended with her covering her mouth in surprise. Keanu exhaled.
Not the breath of a performer or a public figure, but the breath of someone who had just witnessed something honest, something beautiful, something that had no script.
What began as a quiet humiliation in a packed auditorium had become something no one could have predicted. A man mocked for carrying a flute, a delicate, almost forgotten instrument, had responded not with anger or pride, but with music. And not just any music. A sound so human, so raw, that it awakened something deeper in everyone present that night. It would have been easy to dismiss the incident, laugh it off, walk away, make a public statement defending his dignity. But Keanu didn't do any of that. He let the flute speak for him, one breath, one note at a time, and that changed everything. What followed was more than applause. It was a collective recognition, a shared stillness that spoke louder than any rebuttal ever could. It wasn't just Keanu's legacy on the line. It was everyone's hidden longing to be heard, to be reminded that their gifts, however buried by time, doubt, or shame, still mattered. Julian had walked into that night thinking he was in control. The spotlight was his, to direct. But as the music took over the room, the power he clung to dissolved. The real strength wasn't in his mic or title. It was in the humility he saw standing beside those students. In the silence he felt watching Keanu guide them without needing a single word. The transformation wasn't just about a teacher learning from a student. It was about a man who had once lost his voice, his passion for music rediscovering it in the unlikeliest way. And he wasn't alone. The footage of that performance traveled across the country. Viral headlines exploded. Keanu Reeves silences critics with a flute. Actor turns mockery into music. From laughter to tears, the moment that changed a school. But the true magic happened far from the headlines. Parents started asking their children if they wanted to learn an instrument. Teachers dusted off old violins and clarinets buried in storage closets. Donations began pouring in to schools that had once cut their music programs entirely. And at the center of it all was one small act. A man stepping forward with an old wooden flute, not to prove himself, but to honor a memory, to pass something on. That's what stays with people. Not the fame, not the drama, but the unexpected reminder that beauty still matters. That even in a noisy world, there's room for a single, soft note to make us stop and feel again. Julian's confession video added another layer to the story. Raw, unscripted, and heartfelt. He didn't hide from what he had said. Instead, he leaned into it with vulnerability. I was wrong, he admitted to the camera. Not just about Keanu, but about myself. I forgot the kid who used to stay up past bedtime playing saxophone in the dark. I gave that kid up to fit into rooms like this one. But Keanu, he reminded me, there's still music inside me, even if it takes time to find again. His honesty hit a nerve. Thousands of comments flooded in, not just for him, but for themselves. People writing in from small towns, big cities, farms, studios, nursing homes. They talked about piano lessons they quit as teenagers, guitars left untouched in closets, voices that hadn't sung in years. Some even posted videos picking up those instruments again. Stiff fingers, off-key notes, but joy, real joy, in every imperfect sound. The national conversation shifted. Suddenly, it wasn't about a celebrity making headlines. It was about people making contact with a part of themselves they thought was gone. Teachers asked for flutes and violins. School boards reopened conversations about funding the arts. Talk shows invited kids who'd seen the gala online and started playing. One boy, no older than 7, held up his recorder and said, "Keanu made me believe boys can play pretty music too." And somewhere, in a quiet room away from the noise, Keanu watched. Not from the center of the storm, but from the sidelines exactly where he preferred to be. He wasn't looking for attention. He never was. His only hope was that someone, somewhere,
would pick up their instrument again. It worked. 1 month later, a soft package arrived at Patricia's home. Inside was her old flute, fully restored. The wood gleamed with careful polish, the metal joints repaired with precision. Keanu carried it to her living room, cradling it the same way she once did when she'd taught him as a boy. "It remembered them," she said, smiling after playing a soft scale, her hands trembling slightly, but her tone still warm. "They listened," Keanu replied. Mother and son sat together on the couch. No camera crews, no stage. Just the two of them, the same way it had started decades ago. The music they played wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. It carried the breath of generations, of moments lost and rediscovered, of pain turned into purpose. And as they played, somewhere across the country, a young girl opened a wooden crate in her school gym. Her fingers reached in and pulled out a shiny new flute. She didn't know who had donated it. She didn't know the story behind the man on TV. But she held it to her lips, exhaled, and made her first sound. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't in tune. But her teacher smiled and said, "Perfect, now keep going." That's how this story ends, not with applause, but with continuation, with one breath passed to the next, with music played not for praise, but for peace. And now it's your turn. Have you ever had a forgotten gift that came back to life? Share it with us in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. And tell us, what should Keanu do next? Which story of courage, kindness, or redemption do you want to see him bring to life? Leave your ideas below. You never know. Your voice might inspire the next incredible story.